Thank you very much, Sergio, and thanks for sharing those photos, Joey. I'd make a joke about adolescent awkwardness, but that would be unfair. As Joey alluded to, individual differences in growth and maturation have huge implications in sport, and particularly in boys' sport, we see the big emphasis towards the selection of the early maturers over the late maturers. And it's largely because they have hit puberty first, they're bigger, they're stronger and faster. And this has been well documented in research, but it was a factor which led the Premier League to initiate, the growth and maturation research program that we conducted with the Premier League. It's been going on for the last 5 years or so. Now, one of the things that was flagged up by the academy managers was that they appeared to have this big, strong selection bias towards early maturing boys in the academies, and they wanted to do something about it. And the concern being they were over-investing in early maturers, not giving an opportunity to the late developers. So we set up this system of educating coaches, practitioners on the subject of growth and maturation, but also setting the PMA up so it could measure growth and maturity on a regular basis. And this is what led to some of the recent work that we've done in the area of biobanding, which I'll talk about today. Now, the concept of biobanding, basically, it's not a particularly new phenomenon. People have talked about it for quite some period of time. Bob Molina, Adam Baxter-Jones had talked about the potential benefits of it, and we see elements of it in certain sports. The basic principle or idea of biobanding is that rather than grouping children by age groups, you may periodically actually group them by sort of attributes associated with variance in growth and maturation. And as I said, we see it's quite common in certain types of sports, particularly those sports where differences in size and strength may have implications for performance or child safety. So if we look at many combat sports, for example, judo, we look at boxing, for example, they will have systems where they don't just group children by age, but by a combination of age and weight. We also see it in some versions of rugby in New Zealand, but also in some variations of American football, where players who are over a certain size are not allowed to play certain positions because it just would become uncompetitive. So the basic principle is that we can, rather than just group children by age, where we might get huge variation in maturity, we can actually group them by maturation. Now, there's a number of reasons why you would want to consider biobanding as an adjunct to age group competition. And first and foremost, as I said, the big problem is that we see in the academy level an overrepresentation of early maturing boys and very, very few late developing boys. So in terms of opportunity for competition, I think there's a benefit to the biobanding. But in addition, if we look at it from a learning perspective, those early maturing boys are typically not getting challenged enough in their age group competitions. And they want to win, so they rely upon their physical attributes. And the problem is that will give them success at 13, 14, or 15, but they'll also stop growing at 13, 14, 15. And at some point, they're going to need to develop the technical and psychological skills, which are going to be necessary for them to succeed at the top level. And the problem was that a lot of those early maturing boys weren't getting that. In contrast, late maturing boys are just not getting the opportunity. So with biobanding, what it does is it presents those early and late developing boys with new challenges, new learning opportunities. All of a sudden, the early maturing boy can't rely on their physicality. They have to pass the ball faster. They need to react quicker. They're playing against older, smarter, wiser boys, so they're challenged more. But there's also benefits for coaches. The coaches are not just viewing the boys in their age group competition. And we know that some of our data at Southampton, where we've been working with Sam Scott and Megan Hill, shows us that if you look just in age group competitions and you look at match grades, early maturing boys get great grades, late maturing boys get comparatively poor grades. All of a sudden, you turn that around, you move those early maturing boys up and the late maturing boys down. You get to see whether or not what you're seeing is a reflection of their true ability, or if it's simply a reflection of them being an early maturer. So it gives the coaches an opportunity to view the boys in different environments. And if you succeed when you're the early developer in your own age group, but you also succeed and you're successful when you play up, then that's a sign of a good player, somebody you would want to keep. So beneficial not just for players, but also for coaches. Another reason why we might consider biobanding is also to look to restrict the variance in maturity within age groups. Now, some of Mandy Johnson's work has shown that within certain age groups, you might find anywhere up to 5 to 6 biological years difference between the most mature boy and the least mature boy. So to give you an example, at age 9, you may have some boys who are biologically 12 competing against boys who are biologically 7. So you get these huge variations in maturity. Now, this slide that I'm representing here comes from some of our data from US Soccer, where we looked at the provisional squads that made up our first biobanded tournament. And what we have here on the y-axis is the variance in growth and maturity, where maturity is expressed as a percentage of adult stature. And if I highlight the blue boxes there, those represent the age groups and the amount of variation that we get in maturity in an age group. And as you can see in the under 13s, the under 14s, and the under 15s, there's quite a lot of variance. So we get these David versus Goliath situations where we've got one boy in the under 14s who's pretty much close to being a full-blown adult, and one boy at 84% who's not even hit the growth spurt at this point of time. Now, if I remember correctly, in that actual competition, the boy who was at 84%, he was only about 44 kilograms. The lad who was at 98% of adult height, he was over 92 kilograms. So we're talking about twice the size. So what we want to do is to try and restrict the variance in maturity when we bioband. And as you can see, the boxes to the side are looking at two different strategies where we've looked to bioband athletes. And what we can see is that we can almost cut that variance in maturity in half. And what's interesting in some of the recent work we're doing with David Johnson and Ben Bradley at Bournemouth, we've looked at what happens to the variance in size, what happens to the variance in speed, and also in momentum. And we see similar trends that if we bioband by maturity, we can restrict these huge variations that we see within the age group. So that's another benefit of the biobanding, is to take away the physicality out of the game and hopefully emphasize more of the technical and tactical aspects of the game. Okay. So how do we go about biobanding? Well, in the Premier League, we're taking regular assessments of both height and weight of the athletes. We're also getting assessments from heights of the biological parents. And with that information, it's possible for us to predict the adult height of the children. We can then express their current height as a percentage of that adult height. So the idea being, the closer you are to your adult height, the more mature you are. So if you've got a boy who's 12 years, but at 95%, well, clearly they're much more mature than a boy who's 12 years out of 80%. And so we can use that as an index of somatic maturation. This is kind of how the whole sort of equations work that we built into the PMA. We'll collect mum and dad's height. Some of it will be self-reported. Some of the clubs will actually get mum and dad in there and do the assessments. We get the assessment of the child. So here we've got mum and dad, 5'9", 5'10", the child at 13. We get the child's height and weight, and we predict the adult stature. So this child here is predicted to be 182.9 centimeters. And the error is around 2.2 centimeters for boys, about 1.7 centimeters for girls. So of course, if we know he's going to be around 183%, we can 183 centimeters, we can then express his current height as a percentage of that value. So that would put this boy at 85% of adult height. And that's really useful because we know that the takeoff for the growth spurt typically occurs around 85 to 86% of adult stature. So it's really useful information in terms of us maybe looking to adjust training content at that point of time to potentially reduce injuries with these boys. And of course, if we get three different boys at sort of different ranges of the maturity spectrum, it allows us to categorize them in terms of the maturity status. So we got three boys here, one at 82, one at 91, and one at 99% of adult stature. Well, that lad at 82, he's clearly still pre-puberty. We know that puberty's in the post, the growth spurt's about to kick off at some point soon, but we know at this point of time, most of the adaptations probably going to be mostly neuromuscular at that point of time. In contrast with a boy who's at 91% of the adult height, they're smack in the middle of the growth spurt at that point of time. We know that this is a boy we're going to have to be particularly careful with, and this is where we see incidents of growth-related injuries, your Osgood-Schlatters, your severs typically kicking in at that point of time. So being very careful in terms of how we treat them. In contrast, you've got another boy who's pretty much a full-blown adult at that point of time. Again, as I said, they could all be the same age, but varying in terms of the maturity status. And of course, with the systems we have set up, it allows us to detect that going forward. Now, in the biobanding tournaments we've trialled with US Soccer and the ones we've done with the Premier League, what we've typically done is we've looked to restrict those maturity bands. So normally in an age group, the difference between the most mature and the least mature boy, anywhere between 10 to 15%. But what we do in these instances is we restrict the variance in the group to 85%. So in some of the tournaments, we've had boys 85 to 90. So these are boys just right at the start of the growth spurt. And then we may have another group which is 90 to 95. And I remember a recent tournament we had with Southampton and Arsenal where we had two boys exactly in these groups side by side. And they look completely different from one another. The boys who were at 85, 90s, they were kids starting to go through the growth spurt. They really hadn't put on the muscle mass at that point of time. But at 90 to 95, that's when peak weight velocity is kicking in. And those boys, they were strong, they were fast. The game was a completely different game on one field in comparison to the other. Kids of different ages, but all of a similar maturation. Now, in terms of how we do a maturity sort of biobanded game, if we looked at the kind of average age group, we might find, say, in an under 13s, some boys, and particularly those in the center of the field in the spine positions, who tend to be the more mature, who might be close to being adult, whereas we might find some of the kids out in the wing, lateral positions, who might be quite delayed in the maturity. So what we say is, okay, well, let's get rid of those David versus Goliath kind of situations. And what we'll do is we'll restrict the variance within this band to, say, 5%. So we say, okay, only kids between 85 to 90% will be within this band. So you remove those players who may be the early or the late developers from the situation. And then what we'll do is we'll look at the age group above, the under 14s, for some late developers who might fit this band, who could play down. And we might get some early developers who are in the under 12s who might also fit this band, and they would play up. So what we've got is we've got a group of players, different ages, maybe covering 3 different age groups, but all of a similar physical maturity. And so what we're trying to do is to de-emphasize the physicality of the game at this point of time and put more emphasis upon technique and tactics, challenge those early developers and give more opportunity for those late developers to really shine through. And this is kind of what it looks like when we have it in purpose. This is a GIF which is taken from one of our US soccer tournaments. So you've got girls who are all within the same maturity band, but crossing 3 different age groups. Now, those girls in the under 13s, those are our classic early developers who won't be able to rely on physicality anymore. They're going to be challenged more. We have those late developers in the under 15s playing down who are going to get an opportunity to take on and command the game for once and really demonstrate their ability and not have physicality being a problem at that point of time. So new challenges which are slightly different from the age group competition. Now, as I said, we've done a number of tournaments. We've done 2 tournaments we've evaluated with the Premier League. We've interviewed 48 early and late maturing boys afterwards. We've done the same thing with US soccer. And what we found is consistent support from the program for both the early and the late developers. They see benefit in biobanding and they want to see it added to their games program. They don't want to see age group competition taken away, and neither would we, because it definitely serves a purpose. But the biobanding also appears to provide some benefits. Now, as I said, when we looked at the Premier League, 47 of the 48 boys we interviewed said they wanted to integrate it into the programme. But the thing that really convinced us some benefits were coming on here was that the reasons from the early and the late developers were completely different from one another. The early developers, and this was both the boys and the girls, they said, wow, this was a challenge, this was difficult. You know, I couldn't rely on my physicality. They were very honest about it. They said, look, I was playing against older, smarter players. I had to let go of the ball much more quickly. I had to play as part of a team. But they liked it because they said that, you know, in their own age groups, they are relying too much upon their physicality. And they know that they're not always going to have those abilities, and they're going to have to, at some point, develop those psychological or technical skills which are going to be necessary for them to succeed at the adult level. Because when they go up to under 18s, under 23s, they're no longer the big kid anymore. And as such, it's so important that they develop those skill sets. They also identified the fact that they really enjoyed being mentored by those older kids as well, the late developers who were coming down. And those late developers, they did say it was less of a physical challenge, but they really appreciated the opportunity to both use and demonstrate their skills. And some of the work that we're doing in the age group competition down at Bournemouth is showing that those early maturers take over the games in age group games. Here was an opportunity for the late developer to really take it on at this point of time. One thing that was clearly obvious is they stepped into these positions of leadership. They were the older, smarter kids. They took on the leadership and the responsibility. And as I said, they were mentoring some of the early developers as well, which was fantastic. Coaches were coming back and saying, look, you would see this guy say a boo to a goose in an age group competition. But in the biobanding games, we were seeing things out of them we wouldn't normally expect. And having that balance of challenge and balance of opportunity is going to be important in terms of the long-term development. Now, obviously, we did focus groups, so we interviewed these kids, and as I said, the reasons from the earlies and the lates were very different, and these are just a smattering of some of the things that they said to us. These are the early developers. It's made me move the ball quicker than I would do. I don't use my strength as an advantage as much as I would do in my age group. So they're really being quite honest about the fact that they do rely on their physicality. And it's understandable. They want to succeed. They want to get retained within the system. They want to win. They want to win for their friends too. So they are going to rely upon those attributes which will give them that win. The biobanding games, they simply can't do that. They have to find other solutions. They talk about it as being a superior learning experience, but also having psychological benefits because they have played up and they have succeeded, and that's been a benefit to them. And they know now that when they do experience that at under 18s, under 23s, they're ready to make that step up and they can succeed. So the late developers, as I said, there was more opportunity for them, an actual opportunity to kind of sort of play a game, to command a game for once, where their differences in physicality were not going to be a boundary or a barrier for them. A lot of them feeling a lot more composed on the ball, you know, that the bigger players weren't simply going to be knocking them off and having more time and opportunity. Interestingly, in the composition and the nerves perspective, they did notice feeling a little bit more stressed out about the fact that when you're late mature and you're playing down, you better play well, because once we take the physicality out of it, there's no excuse anymore. We expect you to shine in this environment. And the only lad who didn't like the biobanding competition was a late developer who played down and didn't do particularly well on that day. And this was a nice one that they flagged up. They felt that it's given them more opportunity to kind of stay at the club. It might not get them a contract, but at least it will give them that little bit more time and opportunity to be considered within the sort of games program and maybe not released a little bit too early. Now, since we've done that, a number of other scholars have picked up on the biobanding. It's quite popular across the clubs in the Premier League now. People starting to look at the impact it has on things such as game demands. So researchers such as Ben Bradley, Will Abbott, Chris Towson, Chris Thomas have done some really nice studies at their respective clubs looking at how biobanding may change the technical demands. Now, interestingly enough, the players, both the earlies and the lates, told us that it was less physical and it was more of an emphasis upon technical and tactical in the biobanding games in comparison to the age groups. And the data so far from the GPS data, the performance data, appears to back that up, which is really promising because these are independent studies with completely different measures saying the same thing. So what we're seeing in the biobanding games is more short passing, less of the punting up and down the field, more dribbling, and particularly greater involvement for those late developers in terms of having more opportunity to have an impact in the game. Chris Towson's done some really neat stuff as well, looking at RPE, so looking at rates of effort in the games. And not surprisingly, those early maturers are telling us it is a hell of a lot tougher. Those late developers probably finding it not quite as tough, but what's been a real benefit is that those discrepancies between the earlies and the lates in terms of their effort perceived within the game, the discrepancies is much, much smaller in the biobanding competitions. So everybody's getting a fair opportunity and challenge at that point of time. The last thing that I want to leave you with, which I think is a really exciting part, because a lot of the criticism we got early on was that we couldn't mix up kids across age groups, because of the psychosocial differences. Well, a number of the sports psychologists at the clubs have recognised this, and that the earlies and the late matures face different experiences and challenges as they move up and they move down. And Amy Spencer, in particular, at Southampton, has borrowed quite heavily from research and education, particularly work by Vygotsky, looking at what you can do in mixed age classrooms and contexts to actually better support the younger and the older athletes. So Southampton, for example, when they would be moving into a phase where they would be biobanding, they would make sure that the psychological support is tailored specifically towards the early and late developers. So those early developers, they're all taught about failure, how to actually overcome failure, how to deal with stress and the challenges, and how to engage in adaptive coping, because many of these kids have never failed before. So it's a real nice opportunity for them to experience that. And if you can preempt that with the opportunities to develop those skill sets, the more likely you're going to get benefit. And of course, with the late developers, they're playing down. There's an opportunity for them to lead. So we teach them about communication, motivation, organization, peer mentoring, all the things you'd expect the older boys to do in those situations. And of course, one of the best ways to consolidate your learning is through teaching and mentoring. So it's an opportunity for them to further develop their skills and competence in those areas. So I think that's really exciting stuff that Amy's sort of leading there. We have a paper that'll be coming out fairly shortly in Annals of Human Biology from Amy and Megan Hill on that specific subject. But as I said, biobanding, it's a relatively old concept, but a relatively new phenomenon in terms of actual practice. And it's been really exciting to see some of the research in this area. The findings, it's still early doors, but it certainly looks very promising at this moment. And I'm looking forward to seeing more research being done by the clubs in this area.